I'm sure I'm not alone in reflecting a lot this past week on the election of Donald Trump and wrapping my head around the implications, what it means about the people in this country, what it means moving forward, trying to project the consequences and outcomes and next steps. And there's lots of podcasts and pundits who are doing that far better than me. None of those are my specialty areas, so I'll reserve inflicting those reflections on my close friends. But I will say this, that there's been precious little I've come up with to make sense of what's happened, where we are, the path we've chosen as a people. At least very little that doesn't just fan the flames of my own ego and righteous indignation. And that's important for me to remember. I mean, really, because a lot of the explanations, in air quotes, or scare quotes, if you will, a lot of the explanations my mind and heart offer me aren't really about understanding what's happened, but about making me feel better. And often, possibly, at the expense of being true. And this time, in our nation, our society, our communities and circles of friends, and in ourselves as individuals, this is a good time for reflecting on that. Because for most of us, we've spent the last 2 years in a pretty heavy frenzy of thinking about the out there, the world, the future, politics, immigration, the economy, the brutal wars in Ukraine and Palestine, and things like getting our kids back into schools and sports teams and sleepovers. I mean, a lot of us are still recovering from the pandemic and haven't even caught our breath to really wrestle with the challenges we're facing now. But Trump's election, especially after the past 2 years of criminal indictments and convictions and rhetoric and so on, it seemed like a kick in the face that we can't ignore. It felt a little like half the country had the wind knocked out of us and we're just on the ground with those stars and Tweety birds swinging around our heads, and we're trying to figure out what happened. It's really difficult for me and the close friends I've spoken with to wrap our heads around. So it seems like a good time for some serious reflection. I'm going to use, coincidentally, and not on purpose or anything, I'm going to use the same phrase that conservative talking heads have been using, but I'm meaning something different. I think it's a good time for us, those of us on the left, progressives, even Democrats generally, although I wouldn't necessarily put the Democratic Party on the left of the political spectrum, but they're certainly left of the Republicans. This is a good time for us to do some soul searching. Now, I don't mean that in the way that the far-right news hosts or podcasters do. They want the Democrats to move their policies more to the right. Now, they recognize that they're not wanting this. At least, I'm imploring you to recognize that they're not wanting this because they think it's the right thing to do. Right? Republicans and their voice boxes haven't measured any political decision by the standard of what's the right thing to do in years. They don't want the Dems to move to the right because it's more right, or it more accurately reflects America or whatever. The Republicans, just like any far-right party, are primarily interested in power. And it's a power play to get one's adversaries and enemies to doubt themselves. Look at any bully. They may or may not throw a punch, but they sure as hell will talk shit about the person. A really good abuser never even has to raise a finger because they've cultivated a language that their victim understands, and that wounds them far more than a punch ever could, and doesn't even leave a bruise as evidence. What I'm saying is that these pundits and politicians and talk show hosts don't actually want Democrats to change their positions on anything, or at least not primarily. What they want is to puff themselves up and break others down. And I say that with only half judgment or criticism. It's natural. After all, I can hardly blame them. It's so human to do that. I'm certain that it's even unconscious. They probably don't even realize that they're doing it. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that we should reconsider our policy commitments or principles. I mean, maybe we do that, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about the opportunity to really look inside ourselves to discover what really there is for us to learn in this moment about ourselves, about our side of the political divide, about ourselves individually or about our country, about the darker, more violent and reactionary and scared parts of ourselves as persons and as a civilization. We should take some time for soul searching, because few things open us up like acknowledging a deep wound. What has seemed to me in all of this as a helpful way to understand what's happening is the phenomenon of scapegoating, the psychological act of projection, where we unconsciously sense some aspect or quality about ourselves that we don't like, that is contradictory to how we understand ourselves to be, or wish ourselves to be, or how we want others to perceive us. Something that's embarrassing, or shameful, or weak, or evil. This thing we unconsciously sense about ourselves that is so contrary to how we want to think we are, is maybe even dangerous to think, because it's a part of us that, if it's known or seen, we might lose position, or safety, or friends, or love, or whatever. It's so painful to confront that we unconsciously assign that quality to someone else outside of us. And we ridicule it, we attack it, we condemn it in them as a way of compensating for those qualities or shortcomings in ourselves. And this happens entirely unconsciously. In fact, it has to happen unconsciously. If it was conscious, it wouldn't work. If I consciously knew I was assigning some aspect to someone else unfairly, because it really reflected something I didn't like about myself, hoping I could convince myself that they are really the problem and not me. Well, if I knew I was doing that, it wouldn't be very convincing, and so it wouldn't feel good, which is the whole point of scapegoating. This is an entirely understandable and all too human thing to do. We do it all the time, so often and so seamlessly that we hardly ever think to question it or recognize it for what it is. And the fact that it often makes us feel better, at least in the short term, makes it even harder to work against. It's there because it makes us feel better. Now, whatever is wrong is not wrong about me. It's about them. It's the schoolyard bully who is bullied himself at home, or ignored, or insecure for whatever reason, and so he projects his own feared weakness, or powerlessness, or insignificance, or perceived worthlessness onto some other kid, and feels victorious over those feelings because he's victorious over that other kid. Scapegoating is one form of this projection phenomenon, where an individual or community assigns some quality or character or responsibility to another individual or community, and then expels the scapegoat as a way of expiating themselves from responsibility, or from bearing the weight of that quality or characteristic or sin themselves. It's classic, really. And it doesn't work if it isn't unconscious, because it is necessarily unfair. The scapegoat, or the bullied kid, isn't responsible for the bully's feelings or the situation or the circumstance. It's deceptively easy. It feels so right to think that they are responsible, that it's their fault, that it is their fault, that this thing I believe about them really is true. It's powerfully seductive to think that if we just get rid of them, then everything will be all right. They're the real problem, it's not me. Which, of course, it won't be all right, because nothing really has changed. The systems are still in place, or the thought or the behavior or the quality is still undealt with in us, so it'll happen again. It really wasn't about them, so it's necessarily unfair. But for the moment, we feel better about ourselves, so it must be true. It has to be unconscious, because if it were conscious, if we acknowledge the unfairness, if we acknowledge that the victim of our rantings is just a symbol of what we don't like about ourselves, and our protests against them are really just self-critical feelings that are too threatening for us to confront directly, then the projection doesn't make sense. We can't hardly project or scapegoat consciously, which is an important quality of scapegoating, that once we recognize it as scapegoating, it no longer works. Now, this is so deeply ingrained in us that it's just part of being human. It might be hardwired into our brains, into how we make sense of the world, after millions of years of evolution as a social species, when tribal inclusion was literally the difference between life and death. Maybe a part of our brain cannot handle the possibility that we are not who we think we are, or that we're not deserving of the protection and security of our community, that there is something in us that makes us at fault for our community's current suffering. And this is deeply connected to another unconscious or implicit conviction that we have, that what happens to us is a result of something we've done, is a reflection of who we are, or our value, or worth. And this is why people wear nice clothes, right, and drive expensive cars, wear jewelry, have big houses. Partly it's for other people, and partly it's to fool ourselves. The implication is, if we're successful, again, in scare quotes, that must mean that we're good, worthy, smart, loved, valuable, important, whatever. What happens on the outside is supposed to say something about who we are on the inside. Again, it doesn't make sense when it's conscious. Right? I mean, we all know that you can't judge a book by its cover, or a person by the clothes they wear, and that a person's circumstance is only partly a reflection of whatever decision they've made. Now, if you've learned nothing else from board games, you've learned that who actually wins in the end isn't really a reflection of skill or intelligence or goodness or worth. I mean, sometimes there's some strategy, but the reason we roll the dice is a tacit admission that our fate isn't entirely up to us. And yet, even with board games, we feel great about ourselves when we win, because unconsciously it implies that we really are special. We really are a winner. It's so ingrained on us. We can hardly avoid it. It might be hardwired into our brains. Or it might be part of the software that we all absorb really early on. When we do something our caregivers approve of, we get hugs or treats or smiles or good grades or pats on the back. When we do something not approved of, something our caregivers don't like, we get the cold shoulder, frowns, spankings, we get yelled at, sent to our room or to the corner alone, whatever, in order to make us feel bad so that we don't do it again. And the lesson we implicitly learn is that what happens to us is a reflection of what we do, our choices and actions. Our circumstances are our fault, and our circumstances reflect some truth about us, our worth, or lack of it, our lovability, or lack of it, our security, or lack of it. It goes right to the core of us. And because it's learned implicitly, it's really difficult to recognize explicitly or consciously. We don't think it's true. It just feels real. It feels like the way things are, just how the world is. And this unconscious quality is what makes it so powerful. It feels right, at least from the inside. Like when we win at a game, or wear nice clothes, or get a good grade, or the key to the city. Part of what feels good is that we really believe that these things mean we are good enough, worthy of being loved, or having security, being safe in the tribe, that we're not going to be voted off the island. And this natal fear of being cast out is so motivating and frightening that we'll do almost anything to avoid it. This implicit shared understanding that what happens to us is a reflection of our worthiness, that we are always on the edge of being found out to be not good enough or not as good as we expect ourselves to be. That if we even knew about our own darkness or evil or sin, it would be just too much to bear. So our unconscious defense mechanisms kick in and spare us such devastating self-reflection. It must be somebody else's fault that things are the way they are. Difficult, expensive, that eggs cost so much, or that I can't afford a house, that my masculinity is in question, that the world seems so chaotic and unreliable now. It isn't my fault. I'm the good one. It must be them that are at fault. So we find a scapegoat, an individual or community, perhaps a concrete person, but more likely just an abstract caricature of a person or a community. And there's some plausible rationale, some reasoning that's good enough to paper over our emotions. The reasoning is usually laughably or ridiculously thin and circumstantial, and even illogical or self-contradictory, but none of that matters. We want to believe that that goat is somehow really to blame, and that expelling it can somehow make everything right. We want it so much that we don't really follow the logic of the argument. It isn't about logic anyway. It's an emotional reaction to feelings we fear to acknowledge. We find someone to blame and blame away. And it feels so good. It's like a drug. We're willing to do almost anything, accept almost anything, to keep feeling this way. So good to finally have a reason for the way things are, for the present circumstances to not say anything about me and my worth or safety, for the tribe's ire and violence to be directed safely somewhere else, at someone else. That's a seductive strategy. It plays on deep, deep fears, and it's really easy to fall for. Now, I suspect that most people listening to this have probably already made the connection. Trump and the Republicans leaned heavily into scapegoating. Illegal immigrants are responsible for it being difficult to get a good-paying job. Or Biden is responsible for the economy. Or transgender persons are responsible for you feeling like the world is changing too fast and feels crazy, or like you don't know what's going on anymore. And it's a powerfully seductive power play. It works because it's so much a part of how we operate as humans. It isn't fair. It isn't true. It is, when you look at it from the outside, as ridiculous as a village thinking that a goat can bear their sins and carry them off into the wilderness. So no one's at fault for how things are anymore. And of course, they'll need to do that again. The same village will need another goat next year, because the goat really didn't change things at all. It's crazy. But from the inside, it feels real. And it feels good to have that goat or illegal immigrants or transgender athletes bear the responsibility for our insecurities or struggle. That way, my insecure position doesn't say anything about me. I'm still worthy of love and inclusion and protection, even if my circumstances are difficult, because my circumstances are the illegal immigrants' fault, not mine. All we need to do is get rid of the illegal immigrants and everything will be fine. I'll vote for the candidate who will get rid of them. Then everything will be good again and reflect my essential goodness and worthiness of being protected by the community. You see how this goes really deep, really fast? And it's all out of conscious awareness. So it's really difficult to daylight and acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean that it doesn't work. So confronting scapegoating as scapegoating makes us responsible, which then makes us feel less worthy or secure, and our brains can't handle that. So we resist even the hint that what we believe is not true. I think for most of us it's pretty easy to see scapegoating in the political rhetoric and policies and strategies of Trump and Republicans. It isn't hard. It's pretty flagrant sometimes. But recognize what I've been doing, and perhaps how easy it was for you to agree with me. I've been laying on Donald Trump and the Republicans the responsibility for all the darkness in our country, the racism and the bigotry, the ignorance and the cruelty, the presumption and the projection. They're the ones doing the scapegoating. It's their fault. They've ruined this country. They're the ones with the Nazi propaganda at their heart. They're the ones making uninformed or misinformed decisions. I've been making myself feel better about myself by locating all the darkness on them and appealing here in this podcast to you, my enlightened and compassionate sistren and brethren and kin of all good kinds. In some ways, I've been holding their weakest parts against my strongest. Or even imagining that there's a they to begin with. All of it mobilized in an attempt to treat the deep dis-ease I feel and free me from responsibility for it. I'll take responsibility for this now. To some degree, I've been scapegoating. Now, a note of humility here, too. I may be right, at least on some points or to some degree. It helps if there's some factual truths to hang my arguments on, the nail on which to secure the tapestry that I've been weaving. I do think that Trump and the Republicans have been scapegoating and have enlisted unjustified fear that touches on some deep insecurities. There's objective observation of tremendous misinformation on the Republican side that may have caused millions of people to vote entirely against what they actually believe. I think an intelligent and cogent critique can be made there. I don't know that it would make any difference. As I said, scapegoating is incredibly hard to recognize from the inside. And there's every incentive from the inside to not go there, to not recognize it. In the end, I do think this is an important lens with which to understand the past 2 years of political and cultural activity. But I also recognize that it's hard to see from within. So it's important for me to pause and check myself for these biases too. I've created a monolithic them to contend with. And I've tried to diagnose their pathology. Even though I know that they're all individuals with their own minds and concerns. And I've assumed that they knew what they were voting for. Which, in conversations with Trump voters since the election, I've learned is far from the case. In fact, I haven't yet found a Trump voter who actually knew even basic facts about Trump, his character or projected policies, his criminal convictions, and so on. You see how quickly this descends into, look how stupid they are, tearing them down in order to make myself feel better? This go-to programming runs so deep, it's automatic. This is what I mean by taking some time for soul searching. There'll be lots of time for righteous struggle and speaking truth to power and defending the vulnerable in our communities. That's all very important. But right now, let's maybe take a moment to explore the shadow side of ourselves, rising up to meet us in this social moment. If you're game for this kind of introspection, you might start by identifying what angers you most about Trump or Trump supporters right now. Not what you fear the most or even what saddens you. Those are fine feelings to be aware of, but they're harder to get the shadow through. What makes you mad? And then once you have that in mind, or even in your body, or maybe just start to have an impression of, ask yourself, where in your life have you had that same thing? Where have you felt the same or similarly? When have you acted or reacted or thought or felt that? And don't let yourself off the hook too easily. Remember, it is so easy to want to make that goat really the one at fault here. This exercise will probably require you to think some pretty unkind things about yourself, or to look for qualities that contradict your image of yourself, or that are the wrong things to think or feel. Let that be okay. You're not performing anyone for anyone. You're okay. You are safe. You are loved. There are parts of all of us that we hide away or deny or repress or shove down because they're not the right thing to say or be or do. It's easy to say things like, I'm not a racist, or I don't hate people, or I don't vote out of fear, or I don't believe stupid manipulative lies from people who are obviously trying to manipulate me. And it feels so good to believe them, doesn't it? That's why we say them to ourselves, right? Because they feel good. A recent client was walking with me through some of these questions, and they described the profound confusion at what our country has shown itself to be. That we would choose an open, unrepentant bully, convicted rapist and liar, an obvious criminal, thug. Corruption on an unimaginable scale, someone openly committed to their own dangerous whims over and against the Constitution or the notion of freedom or justice or expanding rights and so on. This client, an older person now, articulated that they had believed that our country was built on a trajectory of progress, that things get better, that we get better. Not perfectly, not all at once, but generally that our country was progressing, that we were gradually becoming kinder, more just, more enlightened, in a word, better. And that this election has brought that implicit conviction to a crashing halt. It was all a lie. We're not getting better. There's nothing about us that means that we will expand rights or protect vulnerable people or care for children and others or be wise or smart or judicious or fair. We simply cannot believe in that myth anymore. In the same way that Germans at the end of the 20th century believed themselves to be the pinnacle of global culture and refinement, but voted in the Nazis and the Holocaust and were barbarous beyond imagining. We are seeing that our country is a violent, short-sighted, vengeful, dangerous place to be. And I confess that I've kind of felt that way since the second election of George W. Bush. But yes, it seems particularly powerful right now. And when we paused to consider our own scapegoating impulses, we had to ask ourselves how it benefits us to have the Republicans and Trump be the ones who the ones we heap all this responsibility for these feelings on. What bubbled up for us was this. First, that if our country was not the good, progressing community that we'd believed it to be, that means that we, as individual members of that community, and as our body politic as a whole, are not necessarily progressing. We're not getting better. We're not more loving or just or fair, that we are as capable of horror and barbarism and racism as we have pictured those Germans being in the 1930s and 40s. Whatever our own personal faults, as Americans, we used to be able to take some measure of solace or even pride in knowing that we as a whole were good people. So we as individuals are good people, or at least mostly are, just because we're Americans. We could join with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement with pride. We could join in the progression of our country, the empowerment of women, the protection of women, Title IX, the whole gambit with pride, even if I wasn't doing anything particular in those arenas. But now, as Americans, we can't take that same kind of pride with our country as nakedly vicious as any autocracy in the past, and worse than some at this point. The appeal to that collective goodness has evaporated. And this led to a second conclusion. It's more personal. That if the world is getting worse, and remember how our circumstances implicitly tell us about our own worth, that means that it's our responsibility. It feels like our fault, at least partly, or it feels like it says something about me personally, where before I didn't have to really do anything. I mean, like I said, I didn't participate in the Black Lives Matter protests or civil rights marches. I could still feel proud about MLK from the comfortable distance of decades. And I could put up a BLM sign in my yard and feel pretty good about myself because the collective was getting better, was doing the work. I could take moral credit for it as part of our country. But now all the work I wasn't doing shows the lie. I really wasn't doing much. Before, I could feel like I wasn't a racist because my country was slowly moving away from institutionalized racism. But now, with racism on public display from the highest office in the land on down, I have to take responsibility for the unacknowledged impulses of white supremacy inside myself. Before, I could long for our corporate adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment. But now I'm left with my own implicit masculinist and patriarchal tendencies. I mean, I could blame others, like my parents or my history or my community or like culture. But I'm tired of that. And the better part of me knows that scapegoating some other person or community or institution won't change anything about me anyway. In Seattle, almost every day I drive by homeless encampments or panhandlers, and most of the time I drive right on by. I feel bad and compassionate for a moment, but it doesn't last long. I have to face the fact that I've done very little of anything real to end homelessness in my own community, let alone the world. Every day I decry militarism and violence, but every single day I get mad at someone inside of myself. And while it doesn't come to blows, I taste a little of that bitterness and depersonalization. I oppose the racism and prejudice of the characterization of illegal immigrants that Trump and the Republicans have done. But I also think, and I also know that I think, shameful things of others at times, based on their skin color, before my right mind can take over and drive the beast of my own implicit assumptions back into the dark. I hate the mainlining of sexual assault that's happening with the elevation of Donald Trump. But surely my feelings are fueled in part by some fear that, since I've looked at a woman with lust, or as an object in my life, that I hold a measure of that same guilt, that black mark, that sin. For however violent and racist and misogynistic and unjust the policies and rhetoric of Donald Trump and the Republicans are, what might be the most deeply unsettling thing is no longer being able to think so highly of myself so easily, as I did when I could believe the country was good, or good enough, or at least getting better. What hurts most, perhaps in a selfish, unconscious way, is that they've taken from me the image of my country as a good place, as an entity or experiment or community or collective that's always getting better. Since they've taken that away, it means that I can't look to it to support any measure of my goodness, my worthiness, my justice. And I don't know if I can hold any of those by myself, knowing who I am at my worst, in my shadowy parts. So there it is. I've confessed to my worst, or at least close enough. You get the idea. There are parts of me that feel so vile that having Republicans in power just reminds me of how unlovable those parts are. How much I am unlovable for them being a part of me. But here I am scapegoating again, those Republicans, all of them, as if they're all one monolithic badness. Even Donald Trump, whom I don't really know at all, personally. And I'm quick to assume the worst about him. When I'm calm, I'm sure his mother loved him, or could have. I don't know, actually, any Republican personally who is only a Republican. If I'm entirely honest, I don't personally know any Republican who isn't also a good person, for the most part. And most Republicans that I know, despite how they voted and despite the worst of Republican policy and rhetoric, if I'm entirely honest, I know they would take care of my kids if they were in the same room. So here's the thing, and forgive me for quoting the Bible. Paul said in his letter to the Romans, "Speak the truth in love." And that seems like pretty good advice. We need to speak truth to power. There are truths we need to speak and stand for and protect. There's a lot of hard work ahead of us. But I need to speak whatever the truth is in love. Because if I'm not speaking out of love, or in love, or with love, then chances are I'm speaking out of anger, judgment, condemnation, or weaponizing the truth to make my point, to make myself feel better, or to make other people feel worse. In short, I'm scapegoating. The only way that I can see to make sure that I'm not scapegoating and also not abandoning whatever good impulses and accountability I have in me, right? Because I need to both speak the truth and speak it in love. And I can only do that if I'm not trying to make someone else take responsibility for those parts of myself that I don't like. And this is hard work. It's slow and it sucks. But I don't see a way around it. I have to take the time to love even those parts of me that I have felt are unlovable, so they don't have to hide or hurt anymore. So I may be quiet for a while I get my house in order, so to speak. I'll join you on the picket line, in the protest, on the march, in the petition, but I may be more quiet than you might have known me to be in the past, at least for a little while. There are some parts of me I've been pretty mean to for a long time, and I have amends to make. But then, my friends, when I do speak, I hope love will win the day. At least, it will, so far as I have anything to say.